We have life because God gives it to us, and the first day of the week, every day reminds us of that. The first day of the week in particular reminds us we have not only life, but the hope of life, the hope of the resurrection to life, because on the first day of the week, Jesus arose from the dead. This is among those things that we know every day. It's in the back of our mind. We know every first day of the week. God, though, helps to bring it to the forefront of our mind. We are all busy. We are all distracted in different ways. Sometimes ways we choose, sometimes ways we don't choose. And God knows our frailty and gives us songs to keep in our heart and words to keep in our hearts in ways that we can't even anticipate that we'll need. So let's put these things that we've sung, and I hope something we study will be of help. Last week, Sunday morning, we looked at the subject of suffering for Christ's sake, and that Paul stated in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 that was a reason that he rejoiced. Paul scatters that word rejoice and joy throughout his writings, but we looked at that reason that he offered. And in studying that subject, my mind went to, well, there's some times that we suffer and we can't explicitly, or at least on the surface, say, well, I'm suffering for Christ's sake, and so that's my reason to rejoice in it. I'm glad to suffer in the way that I'm suffering because I know it's for Christ's sake. So, for instance, if you were thrown into prison for reading your Bible, then you might say, I'm not happy to be here, but I'm happy for the reason to be here, and you could endure that. If you lost your job for some reason related to your faith, well, then you might not enjoy the complications that would come from that, but maybe you could find some comfort and even learn to find joy to be given the opportunity to suffer for Christ's sake. But how different would the experience be, or the motivation, if you were thrown into prison and no reason was given? Or you lost your job and no reason is given? Well, the suffering is the same, but if you don't know why you're suffering, would that make a difference in your view of the suffering and how you endured it? And so there are many ways that we suffer. Sometimes they're to be expected, sometimes they're not to be expected. Sometimes we can know why, and sometimes we cannot know why. Maybe hopefully, we already have it in our heart that we're not going to be deceived as many people are, and well, how can I be sure that there is a God because there's suffering in the world? That's a worthy question because people ask it, and God provides an answer for that. That's not really my focus tonight. If we already have our confidence, I'll not deny God because of suffering. That's a foundation, but then that still doesn't take the question away of, well, but why? Why am I suffering? And so that's something that we may wrestle with, or if not, that others we love will wrestle with. And so how does God help me when I suffer? And from all external observation, it's purposeless. There is not some meaning that I can attach to it that would be easier for us than the kind of suffering where it would be explicitly for our faith. And so what does God offer us, and what does God not offer us on those occasions? That's what I want us to consider tonight. I'm going to begin in the garden as often as I can. I often find, not always every question, but often many questions, we go back to the beginning and we find something there that can help, and I think we do in this case. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 9, as Adam is being introduced to his life and his home, God planted this garden in verse 8 on the east part of the place called Eden, and there was all of the fruit that was needed to eat in verse 9 that God caused to grow. And then the tree of life was in the midst of the garden, along with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So I want to think a few minutes about, before we get to suffering, to think about the tree of life that was there. We're only given a few details about that. And what we know for sure is that it was the fruit of that tree would prevent death. So think about that fact. That tells us something about human nature as it was even in the beginning. When God created Adam and Eve, they were not created totally invincible. They would die if they did not eat from the tree of life. It was there for that purpose. They were not created invincible, but there was a preventable solution to death. There was no reason for death, human death, to happen, because God provided this tree. There are some questions maybe about that tree that we couldn't answer. Would the fruit of that tree prevent injuries or illnesses, solve those problems before they started, or heal them if they occurred? We don't have every detail to every part, so we'll just stick with what we know, is that clearly the tree prevented the suffering that goes with death. And so that did not have to happen at all. But then, of course, we also know that Satan introduced sin into the garden. And in Genesis chapter 3, in verse 22, the Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." So then Adam and Eve were sent from the garden, and then God made sure that nobody else would have access to the tree. So, of course, what happened in between Genesis 2:9 and Genesis chapter 3, verse 22 is Satan. Satan came into the Garden of Eden, and we don't have all the details, but we're going to talk tonight later about cases of Job and Paul, where clearly God gave permission for Satan to do something. He didn't send him on as his representative, but we get a little bit of what's happening behind the curtain. Well, there clearly here has to be some things happening behind the curtain. Satan did not sneak into the Garden of Eden without God knowing it and then give this surprise attack. It caught Adam and Eve off guard, but it didn't catch God off guard. And so here Satan is guilty of rebellion. He tempts Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve sin, and so the combination of all that means, whereas death did not have to happen, now death was certain. It was guaranteed to happen. And so that means everything that went along with the tree of life, whatever the tree of life provided, now all of that is lost. And so Satan, we rightly focus primarily on sin. Satan complicated spiritual life and the relationship between God and man. And that's the biggest problem. But it's a different kind of a problem, that he also complicated physical life. That there was suffering that was going to be required of all people, because he introduced the temptation to Adam and Eve. And so consider that Satan deserves blame for the problems that are associated with death, everything that is connected with death, every form of suffering that is connected with death, every single problem that the fruit of the tree of life would have solved, that we are totally helpless against. Satan deserves the blame for that. Well, then, of course, people will ask, and we will think, well, what about God's part in that? Yes, God created Adam and Eve. God created mankind with the potential to die. God provided a perfect solution so that never had to happen. But then God removed that protection. Is God responsible in any way? Well, what we can say is that, yes, God allows suffering, and yet God also knows the suffering that all people would endure. He knows the help that is needed. He offered the help that would mean death and its problems would not have to be experienced. But that's not the only form of help that he offered and that he still offers. And so God continues to offer help and strength in different kinds of ways. And then God even limits suffering. When people say, well, how can there be a God? There is suffering. Well, for one part of that is God has limited suffering by death. Death puts a limitation upon the amount of time and the degree to which we can suffer. But we suffer. And Job said it this way in Job chapter 14 and verse 1, when he is in the middle of his suffering and his friends come and they don't really provide much help or relief. And in Job chapter 14 he says, "Man who is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble." And so Job had his kind of trouble, We may not have his kind of trouble. We will have our own kind of trouble. And God allows that. So, do we have questions about that? Sure we do. Of course we do. Has God earned our trust when we have questions about that we can't answer? And that answer is equally in the affirmative. Of course He has earned and deserves our trust. And if you'll turn to the book of Job, we're going to begin to see that there. But regarding suffering, and especially suffering where we can't see any specific purpose to our suffering, what I want us to see from the garden is that Satan deserves the blame. There may be a lot we can't know, but let's at least put into practice, put into use the things that we can know. Satan is to blame for any kind of suffering that is connected to death. In part, we could also blame Adam and Eve to a degree, and yet then we realize, well, they sinned, and yet I've sinned. And so while their sin is more notable historically, I'm guilty of the same kind of thing. And if you're here and you think you could have made it 1 week, 1 month, 1 year in the Garden of Eden and never have sinned, well then you could look down on Adam and Eve. If you recognize you would have sinned in some form, then you would have spoiled it for everybody else just as well. And so we can recognize their part in that and blame Satan and learn, I hope, in a greater way from our study, to trust God based on what we learn in the beginning. As I mentioned, though, let's go to the book of Job. Job, of course, is the standard book to go to on the subject of suffering and God's part and Satan's part and man's involvement in that. And so consider what we learned from Job. I'll assume you're familiar with a skeleton outline of the book of Job and the highlights. And so we'll just touch on a few points within that. In Job 1, verses 11 and 12, as Job is the subject of discussion between God and Satan, and this is not a parable, and this tells us a little bit of detail. There's more questions that we may have about, well, when does God ever talk to Satan? And do they still have the same kind of conversations today? I don't know all of that, but we know on this occasion in verse 11 that Satan says to the Lord, "Now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and that begins the first phase or season of suffering that Job endures, the death of his children, and the loss of his possessions in a few different ways. And so here what we see is a little bit of an echo from the Garden of Eden, that yes, God allows some suffering, but Satan is not God's messenger of that, just like God did not send Satan into the garden. Satan did that as a rebel, and the same is the case here. God permits Satan to go out. God limits, notice that God limits what Satan can do on this occasion. So you can do anything, but you can't lay a hand on his person. And so Satan takes full advantage of that and hits about as close to a man as possible in taking the life of his sons and daughters, and then things of lesser importance, but still a part of life, his possessions, his livestock, and his servants, and all of those are lost in a day. How did Job respond to that? In verse 20, Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. That's a lesson to learn about Job. The first thing that he did when he learned everything that had happened that day is he showed outward signs of sorrow, and he worshipped, and he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return to the Lord. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job did not understand everything that happened, but the best that he could grasp of what happened, he acknowledges it and finishes that with, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Satan isn't satisfied, though, to see Job suffer in these ways. And so Satan comes back, and in chapter 2, in verse 5, Satan again says to the Lord, well, he didn't blaspheme you for that, verse 5, but stretch out your hand now. Notice Satan wants God to be the one to bring the suffering. Stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord doesn't agree. The Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life. So again, do we wrestle with the fact, well, why would God allow it? Why wouldn't God just not allow Satan to do anything? I'll admit, I don't have every answer to that question. He allows him to. He doesn't send him on that mission, but God puts a limitation there, but spare his life. So Satan clearly has a plan here. This is obvious for our benefit. We see that Satan specifically picked out Job out of all of the people, and the things that happened to Job were not accidents. These were things that Satan specifically chose to happen to bring and to afflict Job with as much suffering as possible. And what was Job's goal? He tried to use it as a challenge to God. Well, you do this, God, and you'll find out he doesn't really love you. But the point of Satan's plan is to destroy the faith of Job. He's happy to see him suffer, but that isn't even his total goal. His goal is to destroy Job's faith. And so Job suffered. But then think about the ways that Job suffered. Have you ever known anybody to suffer because of a storm? I have. Probably all of us have in one way or another. Have you known people who have had maybe even children die in a storm? Have you known people suffer because of thieves? Have you known people who suffer health problems, as Job did, of course, the boils? Have you known anybody whose spouse abandoned them for any reason, or maybe even sometimes in some occasion of great stress? So Job suffered in all of these ways. Notice Satan didn't send a demon to possess the body of Job and torment him that way. What I want us to notice here is that every form of suffering Job endured, it wasn't some miraculous form, some supernatural form. It was storms and thieves and help and the weakness of the faith of his spouse. Everything that he did from the outside, it looks like, well, these kinds of things happen to lots of people. Now, all of those things don't typically happen to one person, but that's just a matter of degree. The type of suffering that he endured is the kind of suffering that most people at least endure in one form or another. And so Satan had a plan in that. Again, it's also clear God is not in some kind of a duel with Satan. God also has a plan here. And so if Satan's plan is to destroy Job's faith, what is God's plan? Or at least among them. God actually used this, of course, in the end to strengthen Job's faith and to strengthen the faith of Job's friends, even by a rebuke. And then, of course, this is still preserved for your benefit and for mine. So Satan targeted Job using common forms of suffering to destroy his faith. We know what happened here in chapters 1 and 2. It's always important to remember Job didn't know any of that. And even later when we do read, God spent a lot of time talking to Job. You remember that from chapters 38 through 42. God said a lot of things to Job, but God never explained this to Job. Before it happened, didn't tell him it was going to happen. As it was happening, God never told Job, here's why it's happening. And then even after the storms passed, at least as far as we can tell, God never explained to Job Satan's part in this. As far as we can tell, Job never understood why. From his perspective, it would have appeared like random, purposeless suffering. And maybe in hindsight, he could look back and say, well, the Lord preserved me, and what else can be thrown at me? I will, blessed be the name of the Lord forevermore. I won't turn and read it, but at the end of Job chapter 42, the rewards, the blessings that God gave to Job are mentioned. And so his life was restored in many ways as it was before. You could never replace a child, of course, but he was given children. It's even mentioned his daughters were beautiful. His wealth was restored. But again, even in this, there's nothing that would have made it obvious to Job that, oh, well, this was Satan attacking me. God didn't do anything miraculous that we can tell. He restored his children, but from everything we could tell, that was just by natural means. He restored his wealth. I don't think there's anything in that makes it appear Job woke up one morning and then just all these animals and all these servants were there. It appears his wealth was reaccumulated by natural means, and then his health was restored. We're just not told anything about that. So it's my opinion is that his health was restored, but it wasn't obvious that it was miraculous, but I'll admit I couldn't prove that. So Satan dealt with Job in a way that on the surface just appeared to be common. And then God even rewarded him in a way that appeared to be common. Now, the one difference, of course, when I read the book of Job and compare to life today, we don't have any reason to think God is going to speak to us directly and specifically the way he did to Job. But again, even in that case, God didn't explain everything to Job. Job still had things he couldn't know or understand, even though in his case, God spoke to him. One more thing, the reason I emphasize these common ways in which he suffered, is there anything that happened in the book of Job, I would say, aside from God having this specific conversation with Job, is there anything that happened to Job that couldn't happen today? Is it totally impossible that someone today, in one day, someone's children and wealth could be destroyed because of a storm and thieves, and then sometime after that they lose their health, and that even their spouse does not encourage them in that? There's almost nothing in the book of Job that could not happen today. And then that made me ask the question, well then, does that mean could Satan still target people today? Can Satan still cause suffering in some ways? And it appears like suffering that is common to man, but in that particular case, because of that particular individual's faith, could Satan still be permitted by God to put his bullseye on their back specifically, so that they suffer in ways that are not obvious that it's from Satan specifically, but it actually is? I don't know why not. I couldn't prove it because Job couldn't even prove it. So you can answer that question for yourself. And then go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians 12, I don't think Paul would say that he was the New Testament Job, but we could make a pretty lengthy list of the sufferings of Paul. And he makes a list of those in chapter 11. In chapter 12, though, he points out one in particular. And so let's think about what we learn from this occasion of suffering. 2 Corinthians 12, let's just begin by reading verses 7 through 10. 2 Corinthians 12, beginning in verse 7. He says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me." Should have said this before I started. As we read, think about the similarities between this and Job. So he's given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, not a messenger of the Lord, a messenger of Satan to buffet me. Just to make my life harder than it was before, to complicate it, to make it more difficult. What do you think Satan's purpose was for sending this thorn in the flesh to Paul? Do you think his goal was to encourage Paul to have a deeper trust in God? No, his purpose was the same as it was with Job, to buffet him, to beat him up in a sense, to cause him to doubt and weaken his faith. But God also had a plan. And so the messenger of Satan came to buffet me. That was Satan's plan. Here's God's part of the plan. Lest I be exalted above measure. God allowed Paul to suffer so that he would be humbled because he had these unique opportunities of the revelation that was given to him. So, verse 8, considering this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, and reproaches, and needs, and persecutions, and distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So at some point, Paul has this infirmity, this weakness that he calls a thorn in the flesh. He doesn't tell us what it is. It seems to me that it's some kind of a physical limitation and complication that makes life more difficult than it had been for him before. And it didn't go away after a day. This wasn't the flu. This wasn't COVID. It didn't go away after a few weeks, after a few months. And it appears it never went away from what we can tell. Whenever this infirmity first began with Paul, again, it doesn't appear that it's something unusual. Again, not knowing specifically what it is, whatever it was, though, he just calls it a thorn in the flesh. I think it would have appeared to Paul, well, now I have this problem, but it's something that other people have also suffered with. Other people would have been just as frustrated with those complications that he was. And so it limited him, but for a certain time, he would have been just like Job, suffering and not knowing why he suffered. And so what did he do? He prayed. And we're told that he prayed 3 times that this would be taken away. And then God answered that. But notice what else we learn here, that this thorn in the flesh was given by a messenger of Satan. And this wasn't random. This was another case where Paul was specifically targeted. And what Satan used was a specific kind of suffering or limitation that from the outside didn't appear to be any different than what other people suffered by. So the suffering was not unusual, but it seems the cause of the suffering was unusual. And at first, I don't think Paul understood that. The only reason that Paul did understand it was a messenger of Satan was because it was revealed to him. So unlike Job never knew why he suffered. In this case, it was revealed to Paul that you're suffering from a messenger of Satan. But he wasn't healed of the problem. It was revealed to him. It was recorded, and so I wouldn't even say that it was revealed to him and not Job as a favor because Paul was an apostle, but that he received that information and it was recorded partly for his benefit, but maybe even more so for our benefit and the benefit of all who would learn from Scripture. Paul had healed other people. Do you think it would add to the frustration? God has used my hands to make other people's life easier and to heal them. Can I not get a piece of that pie? And from everything that we can tell, Paul did not heal himself, and God did not take the problem away as Paul requested. He just learned to accept the help that God offered. And what word is used here of the help that was given not for sins, but the help that God offered for an infirmity that he called a thorn in the flesh. And he says, my grace. Jesus says, my grace is sufficient even for problems that could be called a thorn in the flesh. So what did Paul have to do? He got a little bit of inside information. That's one difference between Paul and Job and Paul and us. He did get that, but the way that he dealt with this was he learned to trust God's help. He learned to plead for God's help. And as he learned that God was not going to help Paul the way that Paul wanted to be helped, he learned to look for God's help and to use God's help and to wait for God's help that he hoped for and that he just couldn't have yet. So all of that here is called the grace. Jesus says, this is my grace to help with your weakness, not weaknesses of temptation. There's other passages that would say that, but in this case, help with physical weaknesses. And Jesus says, my grace is sufficient. And so Paul didn't get a miraculous attack from Satan. Paul did not get a miraculous rescue from God. But he was a recipient of God's grace, of Jesus' grace in particular. So again, there would be some things here that we would not expect today. If you have some problem, physical problem, and you pray 3 times, then don't expect to get an answer from Jesus like Paul did. But I want to think about the other part. What about what Satan did in this? Is there anything that is described of what Satan did that would contradict something about what God says happens today? Can Satan inflict specific people with a thorn in the flesh that appears to be something that lots of people have? But for some reason, in this particular case, Satan is permitted to deliver it for this particular purpose, for Satan's particular purpose. And then God has another purpose for His grace. I can't think of anything in Scripture that would eliminate Satan doing to people today what he did to Job, what he did to Paul, despite some of the differences that we've talked about. So we learn a little bit from Job, learn a little bit from Paul, turn to the book of Ecclesiastes. Also want to include some balance in this. I'm not saying, well, if you're a Christian, then every time you sneeze, that's Satan. He put a germ in you. Every time you run a fever, well, that fever is from Satan. In a general way, what we've talked about is because of there not being access to the tree of life, every form of suffering that is connected to death, if it can lead to death, then it could have been prevented. However that would have worked, eating the tree of life. Book of Ecclesiastes, though, offers some balance. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, is that text that describes there's a time for this and there's a time for that. Verse 1, to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. I won't read it, but maybe you're familiar with this, or if you just skim down through it. But I think we all quickly notice that roughly 50% of the things in this section are things that are unpleasant, that we would never choose, and that are experienced by 99.9% of the people in this world, if not 100%. And so there's a time for all of those things. Don't forget verse 11, though. Solomon goes on to say a few different things, but in verse 11, this statement that God He has made everything beautiful in its time. So connect that word time back to verse 1. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose. So that means everything in this list. Well, we know that the time to be born is beautiful when it goes the way that we hoped. The time for peace, a time to love, a time to gain. God makes it beautiful in its time. And most of the time, that beauty is seen immediately, instantly. But there's a time to die, a time to kill, a time to weep, a time to lose, a time for war. That's also included in verse 11. God makes it beautiful in its time. Maybe the beauty is not as obvious or immediate, but the same statement is made in verse 11 of all of those things. And so where does a time to suffer is not mentioned in these verses, but I think in principle you would see that would fit. And so there is suffering that is going to happen in this life, and whether we live by faith or by faithlessness, we're not going to avoid that by serving God or by not serving God. And the book of Ecclesiastes is a book of wrestling with, well, why are things the way that they are? Look at chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. Here Solomon explains life is not always an exact math problem or a matter of science that we can just explain, this is how things work. He says he saw that the race is not to the swift. Sometimes the fastest person doesn't win, and it's hard to figure out why. nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time, that goes back to chapter 3, time and chance happen to them all. For man also does not know his time, like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare. So the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. And so life often contradicts our hopes and plans and expectations. All of these things happen that would have seemed to produce a certain outcome, but then the opposite outcome is produced. And Solomon can't explain why. And the whole book of Ecclesiastes is things that Solomon cannot explain why, just like we all experience. The first part of the last chapter of Ecclesiastes 12 also talks about some forms of suffering, the forms of suffering that go with the aging process. And so these, of course, are things that are common to everybody. They're not specific to people who trust and serve God or people who do not do so. This is just the natural part of life, the way that it is. Again, though, I would add, do you think the aging process would have been different with the tree of life? I don't know exactly how it would have been different, but you wouldn't have died. Somehow, something would have been different. I won't try to speculate about what that would have been. So, to a degree, the frustrations, the complications, the suffering that goes with the aging process that Solomon figuratively describes here, where he talks about our sight, our taste, our hearing, as they change, as they fade, that makes life more difficult. And to the degree that that's attached to not having access to the tree of life, we can blame Satan for those frustrations, while at the same time realizing everybody is going to suffer in those ways who lives to that age of life. So what's the purpose of that? Don't have a total explanation. So Ecclesiastes tells us that not every sickness, and doesn't have to be physical, not every form of suffering is because Satan sends an attack. So last, think about some conclusions that we can reach from what we learned from the beginning, and from Job, and from Paul, and from Ecclesiastes. First of all, just repeat and re-emphasize to help us remember, when there is suffering in some way, there's something we can attach Satan to in regards to that suffering. If Satan is allowed to target someone specifically today, like he did on other occasions, part of the challenge is, if he does that, we can't know for sure that he's doing that, because when if he targets someone, the forms of suffering that he gives are not unique. They are the forms of suffering that some people receive who are not specifically targeted to both saint and sinner. But let's take a step for just a minute. If Satan does target us today on some occasions, does it change the suffering? If Satan brings suffering because of targeting a specific individual with a certain type of suffering, how is that different from someone else who suffers in a more general way, the same kind of suffering, but not because of a target, but just because there is no access to the tree of life? If there's a target on someone's back and not a target on their back, in some ways they suffer in the same ways, just like people today can suffer the ways that Job did. If Satan was targeting you or me, and we couldn't know it, does it change how we react to the suffering? Well, if I can't know for sure, maybe not. But if I suspected that he did, you can speak for yourself, I would treat an attack from Satan differently than if I didn't perceive it to be a specific attack from Satan. So, does that help? I don't really know. But maybe just consider this much. On some occasions of suffering, again, not every sniffle and cold, but on some occasions of suffering, at least give thought. Satan definitely has some role in this, and he might even have a more specific role in this. We know that he deserves part of the blame for death and every part of suffering that goes with that. And so every part of suffering connected with that, then put the blame at Satan's feet and not at God's feet. If he is specifically attacking us because we serve God, then don't forget his goal. If his attack is specific, then so is his purpose. His purpose is to wear down your faith and to weaken your faith. And if he's not specifically attacking us, well, if it goes back to Eden and to his temptation there, what was his purpose there? To separate men from God, to weaken their faith. So either way, whether Satan is specifically attacking people today or not, his goal is the same, whether it's general or specific. And so put up a fight. If Satan, whatever method or purpose he has, his goal is the same. And so put that blame where it belongs. That Satan is the cause of suffering. Secondly, consider God's role in suffering. And maybe the simplest way that I thought to consider that is Psalm 23. God permits suffering. We see that from the garden, Job, and Paul. We can't deny that. Do we have questions? I have questions. I don't understand all of that. But we don't answer our questions with our doubts or our guesses. Sometimes we leave the questions unanswered and we just return to what we do know. Psalm 23, here's what we do know. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. In other words, I will have everything that I need. I will not have everything that I want. I will have everything that I need. I can understand that. And there's a time for the green pasture and the still water, verse 2. Verse 4, though, there's also a time to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And before you get to the valley of the shadow of death, you descend into a valley, right? You're not immediately at the bottom. And so in the process of descending to the valley of death, there is suffering. Some people may get to the bottom of that valley very quickly, others not as quickly. But the point is, whatever part of that I go to, the shepherd is with me. And whatever my suffering is, I'm not the first sheep to suffer that way. The shepherd has seen sheep suffer that way. He's walked with them before, and he'll walk with me as he has them. And then in verse 6, goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. What is God's role in suffering? A promise that you will rest in his house forever if he is your shepherd while you walk. That sounds a lot like what Jesus said to Paul, my grace is sufficient. So when we suffer, consider God's role in suffering. That may give you more questions. That may not bring every answer, but eventually it will take you back to the Lord if you keep your trust in him. And then last, thank you for your patience tonight. It would be helpful if we could know the cause, right? I wish I could know why I'm suffering. And while that might not end my suffering, at least I could logically understand it and deal with it better. And yet sometimes we can't. We can't know the cause. And so when we can't know the cause, then focus on the effect. What Jesus said to Paul in 2 Corinthians 12 is, or what Paul said, is, when I am weak, then I am strong. Let the effect, focus on the effect. I am weak. This will teach me the strength that God has, and not just that God is strong, but God will make me sufficiently strong. God will strengthen my faith. And we'll close by reading Psalm 131. God will strengthen my faith, sometimes with answers. That's part of how God strengthens our faith. But then to Job's example, sometimes God strengthens our faith without answers, and sometimes we call that a childlike faith, because children will not survive if they do not just trust their parents. In their youth, they do that instinctively. They don't have any other choice. As they grow, they learn through that. And Psalm 131 is a psalm of childlike faith. He says, Lord, my heart is not haughty, nor my eyes lofty. Neither do I concern myself with great matters, nor with things too profound for me. Surely I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with his mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forever. Like most psalms, we don't know the context, but we don't have to, and it maybe helps us to apply it to a number of different circumstances. What he says in verse 1 is, I don't have to have every answer. I am calm and quiet like a child in his mother's arms. He doesn't even cry out for milk anymore. He has all that he needs in the care of his mother. When we cannot know the cause, then focus on the effect. And what Job confessed in Job 42 is almost exactly what Psalm 131 says. There are things too wonderful for me which I cannot know. I don't have all the answers. We simply learn to trust He who does. And in His wisdom, He doesn't give us all of the answers, but He gives us enough. Turn to song number 834. He gives us enough and then teaches us to trust Him with the rest. If you're here tonight and reminded of your sin, then we sing this song to remind you of that. Yes, you will suffer. Everybody is going to suffer. But will you turn to Christ in your suffering? If you're here tonight and very much aware of your sin, then we're singing this song to remind you of the power that can take away the suffering that sin will bring in eternity. You will suffer. If as a Christian you've returned to your sin, then you bring your own suffering on your head now. We sing this song to remind you of the solution to that. You will suffer. And if you have the blessings of living in Christ, we sing this song so that you'll remember why you can grow and why you can serve God in every phase and every season of life. So this song is for each one of us. This song is for us to teach each other. And the song is to honor God. Let's sing this together with this purpose. If we could help you in any way, please tell us now as we stand and sing.
Would you be free from your burden of sin? There's power